Hello, this is international football commentator Derek Ray, and you're listening to the Ranks FC podcast.
Hello Rank Squad and welcome to Ranks FC. It's your favourite transatlantic football podcast and my name is Jack Collins, freshly back in London, just got off the plane from Porto, so it's nice to be back in the capital. I'm joined across the water far earlier in the day in terms of where his timeline is at by Mr. Dean Jones. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. Yeah, much happier to be recording this time. If you think recently we recorded when it was late at night for me and early for you in the morning, and that didn't really suit either of us. So, Well, I mean, it is ridiculous that you're sat here, gone midnight, recording a podcast. We do appreciate your efforts, sir. But I'm happy to be sat here at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, having a nice cup of tea, mate. The sun's about to go down here in San Diego, but yeah, very chilled vibes over my end, mate.
This is more my speed. Recording at midnight is far better for me than recording at 7 in the morning. These are the hours on which I operate. As I've said before, I basically operate on Eastern time now. So actually it's only kind of 7 p.m. by my body clock, which is fine. We can work with that. We can work with that. We're going to be talking about transfers today. The window is open and we're going to be focusing mostly on the Premier League, about teams who needs to win the transfer window and whose season really kind of hangs in the balance in terms of what's going on here. I'll touch a little bit on a couple of European clubs, but you're going to lead us through the main bit about the Premier League. But before we get onto that, there's been a couple of games in recent days which have taken place and really kind of caught both of our attention. So I'm going to hand to you for things we love, which is based on a game that we wouldn't be able to have been talking about if we'd recorded this earlier, because earlier tonight there was the first of the Carabao Cup semi-final first legs.
We don't get to do much match reaction on this main pod. It's more a like general theme that we go for, but we get to do, proper match reaction. It's like a Patreon episode. And we have just seen Arsenal lose 2-0 at home to Newcastle. And I do love it because I've said on Patreon the other day, I'd love a Newcastle-Tottenham final because it would mean so much to everyone. It'd be a proper final in terms of like probably a chaos game. There would be like definitely errors there. There would also be moments of absolute magic. The atmosphere would be unbelievable. It would mean so much to everybody in the stadium. So I was really hoping we at least had a chance of that final. And I said, I actually think Newcastle have got a chance of getting to the final because I thought they could get out of the Emirates alive. I said, let's stay within one goal and you could get to the final. Well, they're 2 goals up. I mean, this is unbelievable. Alex Isak, who obviously Arsenal have had eyes on for a little while now and would love to be their starting centre forward. He kind of tore him apart.
Showing why.
His movement was lovely. His a clinical finish to put Newcastle 1-0 up. Anthony Gordon adds a second in the second half. And Arsenal were a bit devoid of ideas, really. The old corners aren't coming up trumps at the moment, and that's going to become a bit of a laughing
Although,
point
to be honest, they had opportunities and from a number of corners they really should have put away.
They still had opportunities, but anytime they don't manage to score from these corners, people are now laughing at them, saying, because that's that. You won't get any other opportunities. But yeah, I do love this because it's a wonderful opportunity for Newcastle. The away section was going absolutely bonkers on the first and second goals when they cut to the fans, just losing their minds, a proper limbs moment. And Arsenal, trying to assess how they come back from a moment like this, really. I mean, spoiler alert, I don't talk about Arsenal today in the transfer section in terms of the teams that need to win this transfer window. Because I don't think actually Arsenal need to win this transfer window. But I'll tell you what, they need to do something. This team needs something because they are lacking quality, but also some belief and leg. I don't know. There's just some sort of spark is missing from Arsenal at the moment. I think it's probably a forward player that they're really missing. But obviously, once you lose Saka, that's going to be a fundamental problem. And they've proven in the past that there are other players they can cope without. But Saka is proving a bit too much for them. And it's quite interesting that Saka was able to reach his best levels without Odegaard, but Odegaard doesn't quite seem the same player without Saka. I found that quite interesting. But overall, like this is great because Newcastle going to that second leg with a 2-goal lead means that second leg at St James's Park in a month's time, that's an unbelievable cup tie we've got in our hands there. And obviously, I can't predict what happens in the Tottenham-Liverpool game, but that is coming up on Wednesday, possibly when you're listening to this, possibly after. But I don't give Tottenham as much hope of getting through that, but they should be looking at this Newcastle game and just be filled with hope that they can, produce a performance that is as thrilling as this was.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine Liverpool will be looking at it and thinking, hey, a northern side has just gone down and plundered in North London. Maybe we can do the same tomorrow night. But I mean, look, I was on the radio earlier today on Sirius and I was talking to Adrian Clark, who's obviously a former Arsenal player, but also an excellent analyst. And we were discussing this game and how it was going to kind of play out. And I'm with you. I gave Newcastle more of a shot of reaching the final than I did with this kind of injury depleted Tottenham side, especially given the form that Newcastle are in. I don't think that's a particularly wild take, even if Arsenal, have been good of late. It did feel like this was an opportunity, and I wondered what it looked like in the midfield battle because Bruno Guimaraes and Sandro Tonali next to each other have been a really crucial part of how Newcastle have got their acts together, right? They found some really nice balance in this side. Eddie Howe deserves credit for that, and actually running with Jacob Murphy on that right-hand side and not trying to shoehorn Harvey Barnes in, despite the good start he had to this season. It feels like everything is a bit more balanced. Tonali and Guimaraes work really nicely off each other. Tonali playing a little bit deeper, but equally the two of them are smart enough and intelligent in a football sense enough in order to come backwards and cover for the other when one of them goes marauding. And I think that's been a pretty key part of how this has all played out. And I was kind of looking and thinking, I wonder what the Newcastle midfield looks like without Bruno in there. And there was sort of this sense that it might be Shawnee Longstaff that came into the middle. Instead, Eddie Howe went with Joe Willock, who's obviously a former Arsenal man himself. This proved to be a masterstroke because actually the way that he operated in there was far more like Bruno in advanced roles. Like Longstaff is a hard-working player and look, he's someone who obviously cares a lot about Newcastle United. But the quality drop-off from Bruno to Sean Longstaff is quite severe. I thought with Joe Willock in there and the guile that he kind of brings in that midfield role, that felt less pronounced and it allowed them to have that kind of midfield battle and grit without necessarily losing some of the ability to cut through Arsenal. And look, I think that in terms of Mikel Arteta's selection, there's not much he could have done differently. Right, Jurrien Timber came back in after his suspension, which meant that Partey moved into midfield. Odegaard didn't look completely at the races, especially in the second half. But we know there's been an illness in the camp. But, if I was picking the Arsenal starting 11 today, this is pretty much what I'd have gone for, right? And it just was Newcastle being able to take their chances. And look, Arsenal did have opportunities in this game, notably Kai Havertz in the second half, heading wide when it looked easier to score. It comes off his shoulder. It's a really, really bad miss. And at the other end, Isak clinical with his chance. Now, he misses one early on, but takes full advantage when the ball drops to him in the area. That kind of instinctive finish that's kind of a hallmark of a player in form. And then Anthony Gordon getting on the end of another Isak parried shot to make it 2-0. I thought that Newcastle played this about as well as they possibly could have. And this really excellent run that they're on at the moment continues to roll onwards. It's been very, very impressive. And I think that, we were talking about it, as you say, if you get out of there alive, with the game on a knife edge, if it's a draw or you're 1-0 down, going back to St James's Park, which can be absolutely rocking because ultimately it's been, 1955 since Newcastle won a major trophy, if you don't include the Intertoto Cup. For what it's worth, I do. But they have personal interest in making sure that counts as a major trophy. But you actually look at Arsenal and you're thinking, okay, yes, they have, bigger fish to fry, to quote Don Robbie. But equally, it does feel like they need silverware to kind of justify the improvement that's happened over the last couple of years and just give some kind of clarity to that because you have to go all the way back to the first era, the first kind of days of Mikel Arteta's tenure. To see the FA Cup win that they got in that first season. And since then, they've won a couple of Community Shields, which Arteta is always keen to point out. But he also talks about the fact that they want a major trophy to kind of put that all together and actually to be able to lift it and say, look, we have got to the pinnacle of the game domestically. I think that they've been there or thereabouts, but without anything to show for it, it becomes one of those things. It's one of those kind of things that Arsenal fans always throw at Tottenham, right? Yeah, you've got to finals. Yeah, you've been there. Yeah, you've been in the Champions League. But what have you got to show for it? Well, we're getting to a point with Arsenal where you could probably argue the same, right? Like there's not loads to show for it. And Arteta knows that those kind of questions are going to keep coming until he answers them definitively by raising silverware into the air again.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine at the end of the season, Arteta comes under pressure from the fan base if they don't get silverware this time around. And if they do come up short, I personally don't think it would be a good idea to be pushing for a change of manager.
No,
and I
imagine
and also,
there'll be not many teams win silverware. Like I stress this a lot. Like it's not a thing that happens for many clubs every season. But equally, if you have been in and around the top teams in the country, which Arsenal have for a number of seasons now, you do want something to show for it.
Yeah. So there already are sections of the Arsenal fan base that want Arteta out. It's just the way that football is, but. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I thought, in terms of the game itself, just to end on this, you talk about Odegaard and wasn't really at the races. Declan Rice wasn't great either. And what was clear was that Tonali totally showed them up. I mean, a month or so, I was speaking to people and writing about the fact that Tonali was potentially leave Newcastle at the end of this season. It hadn't gone that well for him. But I tell you what, he's turned it around in the last few weeks. They're having a wonderful spell. And honestly, I mean... You were obviously travelling, so I don't know how much of the game you saw live, but Tonali was incredible. Like, it was a brilliant performance from him, and he really pulled the strings at the heart of the midfield. And Isak obviously is going to get all the headlines when you read the match reports and see the Instagram posts and whatever else. But Tonali was the one that really was the engine for the win.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I obviously was on a plane whilst it was going on, but once I landed, I got to sit on a train back from Gatwick Airport all the way through to West London, and it did take me about an hour and a half to get home, which was perfect because I sat there and watched the game.
That was quite good.
So, you know what? There are kind of small positives in all of it. And look, before we move on, it is. Before we move on to our main segment, I did just want to touch on the Italian Supercoppa, which was naturally played in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. But just to kind of touch on it and look at it a little bit, Milan have won the Supercoppa, and they came from 2-0 down to beat Inter in the final. Firstly, this doesn't happen to Inter. Inter do not lose games from 2-0 up. But Milan now have Sergio Conceição in charge, who replaced his fellow Portuguese in Paulo Fonseca just before the turn of the year. Pretty big moment for Milan to make that call mid-season. And I think this is a masterstroke, because there's very little to doubt about this Milan side in terms of quality, right? We know that there are good players across the park. Now, maybe that squad isn't as deep as other squads around Europe, and I'm not suggesting that Milan are going to sit here and win a title or win Serie A this season or probably even next season, despite the fact that they have some very, very good players in this squad. But I think what we've seen across the course of this campaign is that, in that game against Inter early in the season, they showed up and they were excellent, and they won the Derby della Madonnina in a kind of Inter home game, in inverted commas, right? Then they go and they win at the Bernabeu against Real Madrid. And you're thinking, okay, so you do have these performances in your locker. They do exist. Why is there no consistency? And I feel like Milan, for the entire season, have needed someone to be able to drill a level of consistency into them and to make them stand up and scrap. It's felt like they have the talent there to turn it on at times, but ultimately they've been a bit of a soft touch, especially around the weaker sides in Serie A. They've brought in a manager who will sort that out immediately. Now, Conceição has a bit of a reputation for a temper. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in his younger days in Portugal, was known by the nickname of the Tornado or the Tempest because of his temper and the way that he was liable to snap. Now, he's obviously curbed that a little bit. But you kind of look at his Porto sides and you look at where they were at, and they were probably second or third in terms of the talent in the squad, best side in the country over the last couple of years against Amorim Sporting and against the Benfica side under Roger Schmidt and obviously now under Bruno Lage, but who had a lot of very, very good players. But Porto were always in it. And when you kind of look at what their performances in the Champions League look like, even against better opposition, very rarely battered Porto under Conceição. They snapped, they snarled, they scrapped for every ball. They did not lose games by, not competing. And I come into this now and I'm thinking, this is exactly the kind of manager the Milan lead. And so in his first 2 games, Conceição has come back from 1-0 down against Juventus late to win 2-1, and then come back from 2-0 down in the second half against Inter in the Supercoppa final to win 3-2. When you put all that together, the way that I'm kind of looking at it, you're thinking, okay, have Milan grown a backbone in 3 days? Or has Sergio Conceição had that kind of effect on players straight away? Now, obviously, there was a rift between Fonseca and Rafa Leão, potentially between Fonseca and Theo Hernandez as well. Leão is left on the bench here. He comes on. He makes a massive, massive difference. He wins the free kick from which Milan get their first goal back into the game and then sets up Tammy Abraham for the winner late in it. Theo Hernandez scores the free kick and he sets up Christian Pulisic for the second. There is a theme here. These are players playing for their place. And yes, obviously you get a new manager bounce. And there is an element where, when it's a clean slate, everybody has to earn their keep once again. But I think that in Conceição, and look, I don't know if you saw the dance that he put on. It was a bit of a famous thing when he was in Portugal, but the cigar dance came out again last night. Well, I tell you what, when a manager, and I said this on Patreon already, but when a manager comes into a new club and they have a good start, Arne Slot did at the start this year, he goes, look, we haven't won anything yet. Well, Conceição has. 2 games in. 2 games in. He's like, he can't be like, we haven't won anything yet. You have. You've won a Supercoppa 2 games into your tenure. I think it's going to be really, really exciting for AC Milan across the rest of this season. I think Conceição is a wonderful, wonderful coach. And I'm really excited to see what they can do from him.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, look, before we attached to Milan, I should say, is the transfer rumour of Marcus Rashford going to Milan. His brother/agent has been in Italy negotiating a potential loan move. And I'm straight away thinking, where's he playing? Yeah. Leao's got that spot, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, he didn't start at the weekend.
No, but surely not. Surely you're not doing this. Don't do, this is bad. Don't put... No, for what it's worth, I actually think Rashford would do pretty well in Serie A, right? But
I really want him to go to Juventus. I think he'd be excellent for Juventus. He doesn't fit in Milan.
Yeah, I don't see this as the fit. And I'm like, it looks like a pretty glamorous move for him if they can pull it off. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's still complicated in terms of how much of their wages they can take and stuff like that. But I'm just kind of a little bit bewildered by it because I just don't think that this is a good fit. I mean, for Rashford to say, okay, this is my new challenge I was talking about. I told you I had something good lined up. It's like, well, this is kind of luck if you end up here because I didn't see this one coming. I don't really see that this is the move, but we'll see.
We will see. I think that would be a wild move to try and shift out one of Pulisic or Rafa Leão. Pulisic been Milan's player of the season thus far, and Rafa Leão is Rafa Leão, right? So you kind of come to that point. I know he started Alex Jimenez in both these games, who's, a youngster from Spain who's come in and was a fullback and has been playing on the wing in these games. But I think that might be more to do with how Conceição wants his team to set up kind of from a defensive standpoint. And I don't think Rashford's going to offer you that. So yeah, I don't like that at all. There are certain elements of these moves that I really like. And I do like the idea of Marcus Rashford in Serie A. But I don't hugely like the idea of him rocking up at AC Milan right now, especially under new management and trying to work out exactly how everyone fits. I do really like this Milan squad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty, well, we'll leave things we love there. After the break, we're going to be talking about teams who need to win this transfer window. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Ranks FC, where it's time for our main segment. I'm going to hand the floor over to our transfer guru, Mr. Dean Jones, as we start to talk about some of the teams, particularly in the Premier League in this first bit here, who really, really need to get this transfer window right. DJ.
Yeah, let's see who wins the January transfer window. If you do want more transfer content, there's going to be loads across Patreon this month. I'm doing written articles. The first one went out today. It's called Transfers from Paradise. It was a ChatGPT idea, actually, that would be what it called, seeing as I sit here in San Diego coming up with transfer news. I quite liked it. So I was like, you know what? That's what I'm going to call this little section of the Patreon. And so I'm going to be putting out regular articles just addressing the latest rumours, little bits and pieces that I'm hearing. And then we'll do little pods and stuff, a lot of answering questions along the way as well. So that should be fun. But in terms of this episode and winning the transfer window, I mean, what does that even mean? People are like, how do you win a transfer window? And let's be honest, like actually winning a transfer window usually means you don't do very well. I mean, when you consider, I know, like West Ham won the summer transfer window. Yeah, it didn't work out too good, did it? But the January one is a little bit better because you win this one, you save your season, usually is what happens. So what you would look to do in the January window now to win the transfer window is to address the key needs of the squad. And that would be by making smart, effective signings that improve the squad, but also increase the club's chances of achieving their goals for the season or save the season, as I mentioned before. Now, this certainly isn't just about spending big. This isn't about like who makes the biggest transfer of the window. I don't think there will be many big transfers, if I'm totally honest. Maybe Omar Mamouche, potentially if he was to move, like that's about as big as you're going to get, I think, around the £50 million mark. But this is more about making impactful decisions that align with the club's strategy, the finances, the long-term vision, but also fix everything right here, right now. Very difficult thing to get right. But when you're considering like the things that need to happen, you've got to solve key squad problems. You've got to immediately impact performances to get more out of the squad. At the same time, you've got to make sure you're retaining key players. So that's important. Like, how are you balancing this squad out? Okay, you've brought in a few players, but what happened in terms of those fringe players? What happened in terms of somebody that was potentially tapped up by somebody else? Did you manage to keep them? And then amongst all this, you've got to manage expectations. The fan base want this. What are you actually delivering? So there's a lot to take in here. And I mean, let's be honest, like this is all subjective. Like people will have different ideas about who wins the transfer window because, you know, you might have a mid-table team who have done really well or a team down the bottom of the league that end up getting out of it, which is very different to comparing to a side that suddenly managed to make the top four or qualify for Europe somehow. So, yeah, this is definitely subjective to a certain degree, but I think you can see where I'm going with it. At least I've got some way of calculating in my head how I've got to this list.
Absolutely. I like it. Let's get going.
Yeah, so at number 3, I've gone for Man United. I think a lot of people might have put them in at number 1, but I thought that was probably too obvious, and I don't think it's necessarily true that they should be at number 1 because the thing that Man United have that the other teams I had, you know, vying for these top spots was that it's not necessarily that like Man United don't have the squad that should already be capable. They have a talented squad. They just don't mesh together. And they, for whatever reason, this squad just doesn't work. So for that reason, I feel like they should actually be doing already better than they are. But their league position isn't good enough. The key areas of the pitch aren't strong enough for what this manager now needs to thrive. That's important. They've got to offload some big earners over the next few weeks in order to make all of this work. There's talk today that basically the whole squad is for sale. I don't know how much you've seen of that so far, but like there's been some wild reports out of United today that like anyone basically, including Kobe Mainu, could be made available. It's like crazy stuff. But ultimately, we've all watched Man United this season. We've all seen that they're languishing in the bottom section of the Premier League. There's talk of them being relegated, which obviously isn't going to happen, but the fact that it's even a conversation starter is wild. So Man United do need to win the transfer window, and they have to certainly make some big signings. So we know that they need to sign a left back. That will happen. They will sign a left back. They have to sign a left back. You even see the other day when they've got Mazraoui on one side and Dalot on the other side, that even just having a proper player in that position helps. So like imagine they've got an actual left-footed, left-sided defender going down there. How helpful that would be. Like you can't underplay what United would get out of that. Obviously there's interest in Milos Kerkez at Bournemouth, who I don't think they'll get because Bournemouth are adamant that they're not selling in this window. I think they'll price him out of it, and I think they'll be like, mate, just wait until the summer. Like this is a big season for us. We've already beaten them. You don't need to go and join them. But
they'll be like, also Liverpool want you. Maybe that's the move.
Yeah, bide your time. Don't rush into into this one. Obviously, there's Mendes at PSG who's available, and I think attainable, and that's potential to happen. And Patrick Dorgu, they've been linked with Alphonso Davies. That one's not going to happen. And there are various others, but yeah, let's see what United end up doing. They want to really find that left back this week if they can. I'm not saying they'll sign him this week, but they want to kind of like identify and go after that player that they need. And perhaps that's, getting Rashford out the door as soon as possible, getting some of those wages gone is really important, so that opens up the wages to be able to sign someone half decent, because at the moment they can't. They need a midfielder. They don't have much depth in there. There's talk that Casemiro is going to be opened up to join Saudi Arabia this month. I don't know that happens. I don't know that he goes for the Saudi Arabia move right now. I know that Man United aren't actually even that desperate for Casemiro to go in this window, because replacing his experience and quality is actually really difficult, and they've got to be a bit careful in terms of who they get out and who they get in at the same time. So that's another thing that United have got to get right. It's all very well saying, yes, finally, we've got rid of Casemiro, didn't live up to the expectations that his 350 grand a week wages required. But now we haven't got anyone. So now we're in trouble. So that's not great. Eriksen's obviously likely to go, but at the same time, he's not in a rush, because he's not just going to take any old move. He wants to find a good place for himself. So he's kind of just sat there chilling at the moment. And then obviously there's about 3 forwards that could go as well. But United do need a forward, and I didn't think we'd really see them try to do that. But it does sound every day like there's more chance of that happening. So if we look at a left back, if we look at a midfielder, if we look at a forward, if those 3 can come in and then they do manage to get rid of Rashford and Antony, there's even talk like Malacia, possibly he goes. There's 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 players that United will try to get out of the door during this transfer window. And if they could do all of it, then it would be a fantastic window. I don't think they will. I don't think there's enough time. I don't think it's going to be easy enough to find all of these other guys a new home. But they're very open-minded, even about just loaning people out at the moment, just to start trying to fix things. And don't be surprised if Man United do even make a loan signing of their own. But if they do make a loan signing, they want that to be a player that has the ability to sign long term. They don't want to just sign someone for a few months. United have to be wiser than that right now. They've got to have an actual plan for the future. And yeah, they want to have players that feel like they belong at the club and can become part of something. That's what Amorim wants to start building here. And it's very important. So we'll see. I've only put them 3rd right now because 1, I don't think they'll win the transfer window. But 2, I'm not totally convinced they need to win it. They just need to have a really good one.
Yeah, okay. I actually take your point on that. Just to kind of dial in a little bit on some of those things. You mentioned those 3 positions, a left-sided defender who's going to be able to play in that wing-back role, a central midfielder, and a forward of some depiction. From 2 perspectives. 1, what's your kind of pecking order of where you see the most important thing there? And then also, what do you see the club's kind of pecking order at in terms of what they're looking at? If they could only sign 1, if they could only sign 2, where would they be looking to actually make those moves first and foremost?
I mean, left back is 1 every day of the week. That's all I hear about is left back, left back, left back. So that is definitely the most important thing. Wouldn't surprise me, Man United being Man United, if it wasn't the first thing that ended up happening. But that is the thing that they have to have fixed by the end of this window. And the aim was to have it done by halfway through this month, so that it gave them a little bit more time to get the player settled. If it was to go to the second one, it's tricky, because this one really does depend on who leaves. I'd probably err on the side of getting a forward, if I'm honest, because I think Casemiro. If Casemiro stays, if one of Casemiro or Eriksen stays, and then you've still got Ugarte and Mainu, then you've probably got your combinations there that are going to get you through the season. 2 of those 3 get you through, and I think that's Mainu and Ugarte is your central midfield every game if you can possibly do it. And if you can't, then there is always that possibility. I don't like him there, but you can play Bruno Fernandes in midfield. You can do that. So, but up front, there's just nothing there. There's nothing there. None of them are any good. So I don't know really, apart from Amad Diallo, what you're hoping for in terms of that spark. Højlund can't score enough goals. Xerxes he's okay, but he's not great. It sounds to me like he's staying. Anthony Rashford, we've already addressed. I think that they will try and do something in that forward line. It's no real surprise that they're starting to be linked to people. But I just think that Amorim knows that the goals are just in short supply and he's not really sure where they're going to come from.
See, I would almost flip that order. If I was in charge of Manchester United, the position I would be looking for first and foremost is a central midfielder. Now, I've banged this drum so many times, but this is no system for old men. If you have two midfielders in an Amorim system, they need to be able to cover ground, both laterally and vertically. And whilst Ugarte and Mainu can do that, there is just, when you watch Casemiro and Eriksen in there, they just don't have the physical capability, and it's opening up this team to being run through time and time again. We've seen it numerous occasions in various games. But when Ugarte and Mainu are there, it looks okay, right? There's a kind of sensibility. As soon as one of them isn't there, United becomes so incredibly open that I just don't think that you can go through this window and not bring in another body who's able to cover ground in that central midfield area. It's just too risky.
Very
if one of those two players goes down,
though.
No, I agree. But if I was going to sign one player for Manchester United or one position for Manchester United in this window, if all of these things were available and you could pick one position to sign for, I would sign a central midfielder.
Well, they want Ederson from Atalanta. Like that is real, but they know they can't get him right now, and so they'd rather wait for him. And the problem they'll have is that they'll get to the summer and like Man City will sign him or something anyway, because ain't something good enough to entice him. He's at a better team than Man United already. So that's part of their problem. If they do sign a midfielder, it could well be someone that's like young. And I don't think that's necessarily going to help it. Don't forget, next season, they got Sekou Kone, who I think will start to come into the fold. They're using this season to kind of bed him into England, basically, and like living here and start to understand the club. And
that's fine, but he can be the long-term replacement for
he'll
one
be
of
like
Casemiro
a long-term
or
player.
Eriksen.
Yeah, so he'll be like, I would
you need
expect
to fill
Kone
one of those
to be
gaps now. You really do. You need four players that can play that position. If you're gonna leave this midfield,
I think the four will be Casemiro,
Fernandes,
Ugarte, and Mainu. I think that's the four.
That's risky.
Because then the two behind is Zirkzee and Diallo and possibly Garnacho. And then you have Højlund basically 9 times out of 10 as your number 9, which I don't think is good enough. But
it might not be, but at the same time, like I do think that there have been flashes from Rasmus Højlund which suggest that he is a good footballer and able to do things. Now, it wasn't his best game at the weekend, agreed. But I think in terms of what Amorim wants, in terms of spearheading the press, in terms of getting in behind teams, he can do a job in those areas and he will score enough goals that he'll be okay. Like I think that in terms of the structure of an Amorim system, the midfield feels like the place that they need to fix first and foremost. Yes, left back is an issue, but Diogo Dalot did a really good job there, obviously, at the weekend against Trent. Part of that is potentially that Trent had an absolutely dreadful game, but like equally, I think that Dalot can do a job there. If Malacia comes back into the fold and starts to actually get minutes again, then maybe having a little experiment to see what that looks like. But
I don't think Malacia will be there, if I'm honest. I think Malacia will be gone. So I think that's again part of the problem. They will move on from him, and that's this part of the vision, is that it's such an important part of the way the team functions, and I think they just feel that they're short there, and they don't want to just have to rely on Dalot to play there. I'm going to move on to number 2 now, and I'm going to shift across the city, because at 2 I have got Manchester City as a team that needs to win the transfer window. I mean, it is unbelievable what we've seen from them, or I should say haven't seen from them so far this season. They're 6th in the Premier League. They're on 34 points. Liverpool are, of course, top of the Premier League at the moment on 46 points, and they have played a game less than Manchester City. City, as it stands right now, outside of like the European places, if you were to consider what the Champions League and Europa spot would look like right now. I mean, obviously that'll probably change, but City have got a lot of work to do to even make the top 4. Now, I think they will, but they are fighting here to save their season. So when I'm talking about those kind of things that you need to improve, so you've got to solve key squad problems. They've got loads of them. You've got to have an immediate impact on performances. Good, because their performances have been dreadful even when they've won. Retain key players. Well, their key players have been part of the problem this season. And then you've got to manage expectations. And I tell you what, this City fan base are not used to this. If you're a young City fan, I don't know, under 20 or under. Like, you've never really known anything like this. So it's a really key time. You've got Foden and Kevin De Bruyne underperforming. Kevin De Bruyne probably leaving to join me here in San Diego. Foden, one of the biggest fall-offs we've ever seen from a footballer of the year. Obviously, Rodri's injury has just been beyond what anybody expected it could be, but they've had other injuries across the board too. I think goalkeeper Edison looks like he's going to be leaving. Doesn't seem to be in Pep's good books at the moment. Obviously, Pep himself has signed to stay, so that suggests to me that he'll get to build one more version of his Manchester City team. Literally looking all over the pitch right now, Manchester City need reinforcements, like everywhere. They're being linked with left backs, right backs, centre midfielders and forwards. It's unbelievable. And I spoke to somebody at Manchester City just as the window was about to start, and I tried to get a gauge of like what the expectation should be. And he was kind of like nothing and everything. He was like, this could be a window where City end up loaning a couple of players, or it could be a window where they go and spend £200 million. Just crazy, really. City aren't typically a team that go to the loan market in January. Not really something they've looked to do. They haven't really had to before because they're usually kind of in control of their own destiny. This time they're not. So the types of players, Omar Marmoush, I've just spoke about a minute ago. I mean, he is on City's radar. Interestingly, last week when I checked the story out, because I wasn't really convinced by it, I was told by somebody at City that, yep, a player we completely admire, not somebody we think we're going to be able to get out of Frankfurt halfway through the season. So I was like, okay, that's fair enough. That's kind of similar to what I've heard from Arsenal. And in the last few days, it hasn't gone away. Today, Sam Wallace at The Telegraph wrote again about Marmoush and Man City. And I tell you what, checking it out a little bit further with a couple more contacts, I think Frankfurt would sell. I think Frankfurt here are looking for a bidding war to open up so that they can sell Marmoush at a better price. You get paid more basically in January than you would get in the summer if Marmoush goes now. And obviously, like, there's the thing, well, Frankfurt won't want to lose him now because it could affect the second half of their season and what they can do Champions League-wise and stuff like that. But you'll probably get at least a little more money now, maybe the same money, who knows. But I think that £50 million upwards, £50 to £60 million, City could get Marmoush. And I didn't really expect that to be happening. But I posted about this today on the Patreon. And I was kind of writing about it. And one of our patrons, Cooper, said Marmoush to City feels like it would be a really good fit. He might fill that Julian Alvarez size hole quite well. And obviously that's what they've been missing too. Julian Alvarez doesn't get talked about enough, how much they've missed that sort of player. Marmoush is versatile, he could play wide, could also play as an alternate to Haaland or off of Haaland. So that's interesting. They're also looking for central midfielders. Don't think they'll be able to get Zubimendi right now. Not sure they get Edison either. They wanted both those guys. They might have to scratch around a little bit for that CM. I'm
not sure, that the Zubimendi is the answer for Manchester City. I know that he replaced Rodri and but they have to think long term for this, right? If they're going to go and spend 50 odd million on a central midfielder, they have to be thinking about someone that's going to be able to play alongside Rodri or in a more advanced 8 position at the point where he returns. If I was Manchester City, I would be going to Monaco. I would be marching over to Monaco and basically be like, how much do you want for Lamine Camara? Now, I know he only moved to Monaco from Metz in the summer and he might not move straight away again. But considering what we've seen from him, international level with Senegal, he's 21 years old. He's already got 25 caps for Senegal, scored 6 times. He pops up with important goals. He has a lovely box-to-box kind of presence. He has the kind of capability and the footballing nous in order to actually sit at the base of this midfield. Loads of time to be, kind of molded by Pep into the player that he wants to be. I think there's so much to like about Lamine Camara. And, bearing in mind, he's just turned 21. We're getting to a point here where I think someone is going to gamble on this kid at some point. And if you're going to go and make a splash, I feel like City have been kind of behind the line for the first time in a while with their recent additions. Obviously, they let a lot of young players go. And they felt like the squad has aged without anything to kind of try and drag it back towards where it should be. They need to get the jump on a couple of their rivals here and start to make this squad younger. And I think that in Kamara, you might be able to get for around, 30 odd million. He signed for Monaco for 15 million euros in the summer. If you put 35 million euros on the table for them right now, I think they'd sell. They'd sell. And I think that you would be bringing in a player who has the capacity to go right to the top of the game in his position, who has that experience on an international level, but also in Liga. I think that there has been plenty of players who've made that transition successfully. That's exactly what I'd be going to do right now.
Yeah. I think another alternate is Douglas Luiz at Juventus, who's available.
Bring him home.
On loan. Like, City have thought about it before, right? They considered this previously when he left to go to Juve, and he's not in Thiago Motta's plans at the moment in terms of the starting 11. I've spoken to my contact at Juve, and he says the club and the agent are both on board with the fact that he still stays, even though he's not in the first 11 right now, and that there's no need for him to move. But I then spoke to a journalist that covers them, and he said, yeah, take that with a pinch of salt. We're all expecting him to leave. So we'll see what that ends up as. But I think that actually Douglas Luiz, getting him in on loan, isn't a bad deal at all. And as somebody else said to me, he said, well, if they're in the market for loan deals, go and get Dani Olmo at the same time. He's a player they were linked with last summer, and they didn't end up getting him. If they could end up with Dani Olmo and Douglas Luiz on 6-month loan deals to try and help save their season, two of the best signings of the window.
Yeah, they would be.
I'm not saying it'll happen, but you know what I'm saying. They need to win this window, though, mate, because like they need to get. They could easily finish second in the Premier League, easily. Like, it doesn't take a lot actually to catch up that. I don't think they can catch Liverpool. I don't think Liverpool are going to fall off enough for that to happen. But Arsenal in second place on 40 points, and the way that they're looking right now, only 6 points ahead of Manchester City, definitely catchable for this Man City team. So I think when you consider that you could still finish second in the league, you could still go and have a good run in the Champions League, you can still go and win the FA Cup. Like, Pep's got to ignite this team. A really, really crucial transfer window for them. And yeah, they've won a lot of things in the Premier League in the past 5-6 years. This is the thing that they need to win right now, the January transfer window.
What do you make of this Kusanov deal before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to barge in their way to the front of the line for him. But he's not the only player of that level, that profile, I should say, that they're looking at. They also like Juma Bar, who's been playing in Spain on loan. And there's another player at Juventus, Savona, is it, the right back?
Yeah. Good
who
player.
actually is a right back, but Man City see him actually as a centre back. So
Pep sees everyone as centre backs.
Yeah, exactly. So like those players are all similar age, like 20 years old, around there. So I think they're looking for just a player of that kind of age profile to come in as like an emerging player. They might have to play this season, depends how bad injuries get again. But I think that's more something they're just still starting to kind of think about the future.
I probably should have brought this up in the Manchester United segment as well, but I'm surprised that no one's had a look at Tom Rother at Union Berlin, because he had a brilliant season last year with Holstein Kiel as they came up from the Zweite. He's instilled himself as Union's first choice left wing back, can play both of those roles. And I'm intrigued to see what Pep does in terms of his profiling on fullbacks, because obviously Kyle Walker has been a stalwart for many a year, but does he go in and buy someone else who's very similar to Kyle Walker? What does he do on the left? Obviously, Gvardiol's been playing there, but I think that his long-term future remains at centre-back. How do they profile for these positions going forward? What does Pep's system look like going forward? All of that's going to be quite interesting to see. But Rother's one that I think both Manchester clubs should probably be keeping an eye on right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I got distracted then for a second. There's some quotes from Arteta going around about their defeat to Newcastle, and he's basically blaming the ball. He says the ball in the Carabao Cup is very different to the ball they use in the Premier League in terms of the way it flies off the foot, in terms of the way it feels. A ball's a ball, mate. You're all playing football. I know that I can believe that the ball is slightly different, but you're all still playing football, right?
As Diego Maradona once famously said, the ball doesn't stain.
So funny. I love it though when stuff. I love quotes like that. They really crack me up. Anyway, should we move on to number one and the team that really, really does need to win the January transfer window?
Can I guess?
Yeah.
Is it Tottenham Hotspur?
It's Tottenham Hotspur. Like that. Like I'm not sure if there's ever been a time when a team's needed to win the transfer window as much as this. Now you could argue that like a team like Everton needs to win the transfer window to like stay in the Premier League and stuff. And it's like, okay, yeah, but like realistically, like what are Everton really going to do? Like
Everton need to win the changing managerial schedules battle, I think, more than
Everton needs
else.
to just win a game, first of all, rather than anything else. So, yeah, and I think that once Everton replace Sean Dyche with David Moyes, then we'll start to see things start to change anyway. But you look at Tottenham and you think of the parameters that I set out at the start of the episode. We are looking here at a Tottenham team that are 12th in the Premier League, right? Injuries have absolutely decimated the squad. They have been playing kids. They've got a squad imbalance because they've got players playing out of position. They've got a key player underperforming in Son, which nobody would have really seen coming. It seems like it's probably a reaction to his injury that he had. That he's playing within himself a little bit, but you know, something that you wouldn't have expected to come this season. There's huge pressure on the manager because of the results more than the performances that have actually been put together. And when you look at that, you're like, oh my, what a mess. What a total mess. But it can be saved. If they don't win the window, they're going to finish mid-table. They're going to sack the manager. They're not going to be in Europe.
They're going to be back in the cycle of death, yeah. Back
in the cycle of death. Romero will leave. Pedro Porro might leave. Suddenly you're like, Sonny might, I know, just signed a new extension, but who knows? He might leave. I'm not sure that matters anymore. But this is so important that they get this. And what's important is that Daniel Levy actually realises it. Because Ange Postecoglou coming into January window, I wrote an article on it actually on Give Me Sport, and it was kind of like, Tottenham was setting out to sign a left-sided defender in the January transfer window. And beyond that, there doesn't seem to be much promise of anything else. But Ange Postecoglou wants at least 3 players, possibly 4. And that obviously includes the defender, but also definitely includes a central midfielder and definitely includes another attacker. And as it turns out, it's obviously signing another goalkeeper as well. So if they can get these 4 players in, like, it does start to change everything for Tottenham and change what they're capable of. And you see right now, like they are on the verge of signing Kolo Muani, but they are in the discussion to sign Kolo Muani, which is an initial loan deal. PSG want there to be some sort of obligation to sign Kolo Muani for around 60 million euros. Tottenham aren't going to do that.
That seems really reasonable.
They're not going to do an obligation because they don't want to get burned on it. And there's a chance he's like Timo Werner or something. And, you know, I know Werner hasn't got an obligation, but it's just as well because they would be not very happy with that. And you don't really know that Kolo Muani is definitely going to fit in. But if there's an option on it, Spurs are definitely open to the idea of signing him, whereas some of the other teams in for him, like Juventus, aren't so much. For Kolo Muani himself, this is a really key stage of his career. He's got to get this right. So while Tottenham right now are trying to accelerate this deal and be like, choose us, let's go, let's sign it, he's kind of a little bit like, okay, yeah, I like the idea, like it's cool, but let's see what else I can do, because he needs a little bit more space to consider that this is definitely the right move. But getting Kolo Muani in would be great, but at least we now know as well that from this early intent that Tottenham are going to go and look for a player in their attack. They're also looking at central midfielders, and I don't think it's going to be anyone earth-shattering. They've looked at Angel Gomez, who obviously becomes a free agent in the summer. I think primarily that's what they're trying to trigger at the moment, just to get him as that free agent to come in the summer. But I know there's also been some inclination as to like, but what about now? What about if he came now? Because obviously he wouldn't cost that much to get in now. They've also looked at a few others. There's another player in Liga called Andy Diouf that they've been scouting for quite a long time.
I like Andy Diouf a lot.
Do you? I mean, I've never seen him play, but I've written about him a lot because Tottenham have been tracking him for well, they've probably been tracking him for a long time, but I've been writing about him probably for 6 or 7 weeks. And Tottenham sense an opportunity in both of those players that are playing in Liga to go and get them right now before others get on board. And I know that they've had representatives in France this week for all 3 of those deals, Koulibaly, Gomez and Diouf. And it's because they're having to move fast, because I think they just know that this is desperate times, desperate measures. And it seems they're trying to support Ange Postecoglou. He's not on the verge of losing his job, but he probably is on the verge of losing his patience. Every press conference, he seems like a broken man at the moment. And I feel sorry for him because the results don't look good. And they don't necessarily reflect some of the performances, but also, when you look back in history, look back at some of these results, you won't realise how depleted his side is and how many different centre-back combinations he's had to try out and all these sorts of things, right? So, yeah, I think that this is all just like so important. These positions and the lack of depth that now exists because of the injuries, it just really has, I've used the word a few times in this episode, but it's decimated this squad. And they've just got to go and make 3-4 signings.
Yeah, 100%. I think Juve would be a really good one because he does a lot of things very, very well. Like he can play in a couple of different roles. He's an exceptionally good ball carrier in terms of the way that he picks up the ball and just drives through the heart of midfield. And I feel like Spurs need legs in the middle of this midfield in order to try and deal with the fact that they are left so open. And look, part of that is the way that Ange Postecoglou plays, right? And this desire to go man for man across the entire pitch. You need athletes to kind of pull that off. And Juve feels like the kind of player who can come in there, another young midfielder who'll be able to add to that rotation and add to the legs in that midfield. So I do really like that, but I think you're completely right. Like this feels like such a massive window for Spurs. And I don't mean that in terms of, I think the Spurs are going to go on and, challenge for a Champions League spot, because I think they've left themselves too far short. But I do think there is an element here where you look at, maybe the Carabao Cup has come too early in the campaign, but you look at the FA Cup, you look at the Europa League and think, okay, here's where your opportunity is to show that there has been genuine progression and that you have a kind of game plan going forward. That looks like the best route back into Champions League football, for one. But two, I think it looks like the best route to a trophy, which is something that obviously hangs over Spurs and is this kind of monkey on their back that they can't get rid of until they lift silverware into the air. And I think that, with what they've got going here and the way that this side is, you kind of brought it up at the start, and I think this is kind of a crucial part. Spurs felt like, last year that they had kind of a long-term vision and a plan. And we've talked about this on The Truth recently. We talked about, the whole episode on Spurs and what their squad building and planning was. And actually, so much of it was felt kind of stuck between stations in that they're like, okay, we want to go make our statement signing, but also we want to prepare for the future. They've kind of done neither by kind of sitting in the middle of that ballpark. It's time for them to make a decision in that kind of regard. And I think that this is a real opportunity to do that and set themselves up, one, for the back end of this season, and two, saying that if they can then have a good back end to this season and keep themselves on a progression path rather than just diving back in. I mean, you said it the other week that if Spurs moved away from Ange Postecoglou, one of the names high up on their list is Edin Terzic. And it blew my mind. Because honestly, I don't understand where you're going with that kind of appointment. I don't understand if you think that Edin Terzic comes in and does a better job with this squad as it currently stands than Ange Postecoglou, then you're watching a different game to me, right? Like it's one of those things. And so that being even in the conversation really, really kind of threw me in terms of where Spurs were. As much as I would hate it from a Fulham perspective, if Spurs sacked Ange Postecoglou and brought in Marco Silva, or they brought in Antonio Raiola, or even like a Thomas Frank, I think you'd be looking at it and thinking, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I can understand where you're coming from. Sure, whereas I do think that if they went in and got Terzic, I'd be like, you have no plan. And for me, the entirety of Spurs kind of moving forward relies on the idea that they have a strategy to kind of go long term on these things. And I think this window is going to be a great indication of actually whether they believe in that or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we'll see. A bit of work to do, but Tottenham do seem like they are busy men at work right now. So maybe even by the end of this week, we start to get breakthroughs on some of those deals.
Okay, absolutely. Right. We will leave the main segment there. And our final segment after the break, going to touch on a couple of sides or in Europe who I think might need to do some work in this window as well. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the third and final part of Ranks FC today, where I wanted to take us on to a couple of things in Europe. And some of these will be on your radar, and I imagine some of them will be less so. But Dean, I kind of wanted to start with the big one, which is Barcelona, right? Yep. And obviously the major thing hanging over Barcelona right now is the registration of Dani Olmo and Pau Victor. Now, one of those is obviously more important to this Barcelona squad than the other, but they both matter in terms of where Barcelona are. Now, the interesting thing about this, and I've been doing a lot of reading into this deal in terms of registrations and how things are kind of panning out. And what's really interesting from my perspective is that you're looking at it and seeing where Barcelona are financially. And apparently, from reports in Spain, the line is that the Spanish Federation are pretty content with how Barcelona have gone about their business in trying to reduce wage bills and trying to increase finances. And it's not to do with their registration cap that they can't re-register Dani Olmo and Pau Victor. It's because when a registration expires, which they did on the 31st of December, you're not allowed to re-register a player for that season. It stops people kind of deregistering and re-registering other players, right? It's a kind of safety measure put in guard. So what's really intriguing, this is now in the Spanish courts where Barcelona have kind of appealed for an injunction on this to be like, look, we're clearly not trying to cheat the system. We were just trying to get our finances in place, which actually for once I kind of believe. It doesn't necessarily make it right. And then there'll be other clubs who are like, that's not fair. We're not allowed to do that. But I do think in this case, they're not actually trying to cheat the system in that regard. They just have got to a point where they thought these registrations would be accepted and they haven't been. What happens now, though, is really interesting. I saw Rafinha talking about this today. He was like, look, if I was a player and we were trying to bring players in and I saw what had happened to Dani and Pau, I would have reservations about joining Barcelona at this point. And it's worth remembering that Rafinha wasn't registered until the final day he was allowed to be before he joined, obviously a couple of seasons back, that actually allowed him to start playing for the club. So he mentions this. He says, look, I'm glad I did it, but it did go down to the wire for me as well. But I am intrigued because if the courts decide that Dani Olmo cannot be registered and Pau Victor cannot be registered, I wonder where Barcelona go in this window. Now, I imagine both of those players get loaned out. I would be absolutely gobsmacked if Dani Olmo of the Barcelona Academy, of La Masia, activates the clause which is reportedly in his contract, which allows him to walk away for free if he's not registered. I would imagine that he will go out on a 6-month loan deal and come back in the summer. So, if that happens, how do Barcelona respond? Because ultimately, right now, we're at a situation where without those two players, even with those two players, to be honest, they look incredibly light in forward areas. And with the burden that's laid on Lamine Yamal, who looks like he's going to be back, which is obviously a brilliant thing from a Barcelona perspective. But we've seen already him really struggling this year in terms of his fitness compared to other seasons because of an element of overuse, right? And that's nothing to be kind of shocked by. It happens, and we've seen players who come in and do really, really well, and then basically you want to play them every game. That's fine. But actually, without Dani Olmo and Pau Victor, this kind of attacking line basically consists of Ferran Torres, Ansu Fati, who's basically been bombed out the squad, Robert Lewandowski, who is obviously getting on a bit at this point, Rafinha, and then kind of you shift around with Lamine Yamal, obviously, but you're trying not to play him too much in order not to get him injured. And then you have to dig deep into La Masia. Now, that's fine in itself, and we've seen some major success stories. And obviously, Tony Fernandes getting a run out in the game that they played in the Copa del Rey the other day was nice. And it was nice to see him get those moments. But that is incredibly light. And considering they have fallen off from their position of real strength in La Liga earlier in the season to a point where they're now third and relatively comfortably third, the second half of this season really relies on Barcelona getting it right, I think, here, and actually bringing in players that allow them to rotate in those areas so that they don't overuse and overstretch some of the players that they have. Now, I think this Barcelona side have been, on the whole, pretty excellent over the course of this season. And I do think that there is an opportunity for them here, maybe not to win La Liga, maybe they don't have the depth for that, but definitely to win a trophy, to go deep in the Champions League, because on their day, I don't think there's many teams that can live with them. So how do you deal with that going forward? And I find it really intriguing to see what happens here, especially from a forward perspective of what Barcelona do if they cannot re-register Olmo and Pau Victor.
Yeah, absolutely bizarre situation. But they were in control of La Liga at one point when they beat Real Madrid. It was like, oh, that's it then. They're going to go and win the league. They're now third in the league and they're trailing Real Madrid by 5 points. So they need to kind of win this situation over to get their season back on track or their title hopes back on track as well. It just looks embarrassing, really. And it is embarrassing, I think, and kind of disrespectful to Dani Olmo in the situation, the way that he's been treated. And he's kind of having to put a brave face on it. So we've never really, in England, we can't really relate to this because it's so different to anything that we see in our own game. I mean, there are many faults to the Premier League, but we don't see this. But it's fascinating, and I'm very intrigued to see how they manage to get themselves out of it.
Yeah, 100%. Quickly to Germany, because I kind of wanted to talk vaguely about RB Leipzig, who I had pegged at the start of this season as potential challengers in the Bundesliga, which they started really well in, is worth remembering. They've been bombed out of the Champions League in the league stages. They cannot qualify now. And this is a really interesting squad because there's so many young players here who are exceptionally talented. But ultimately, we're at a space here with Leipzig where if they don't show that they can compete, a lot of these players are going to move on, right? Even the players that have come in this summer, the likes of Antonio Nusa, if they can't see themselves on a path, Nusa was convinced to join this project on the back that he would be challenging for trophies, that he would be in fights to play in the Champions League, that he would be able to be in the Champions League knockout stages, things that you would imagine Leipzig would have offered quite obviously because they would have just backed those claims themselves. He had Schroeder joined in the summer. Nusa joins in the summer. Xavi Simons comes in on loan once again. But actually, you look at this squad and you think, wow, you've got work to do. Because honestly, if things don't improve in the second half of this season, how many of these young players are going to be like, is this the place for me? No one's joined Leipzig, let's be perfectly honest, because they're like, yeah, what a wonderful place to play football from an atmosphere perspective, right? Yeah, I grew up wanting to play for RB Leipzig. This doesn't happen, right? So you have to take things with a pinch of salt. What they do offer is competitive football in an interesting system and also a pathway to other clubs. But if that falls apart, then suddenly a lot of these players are going to be looking elsewhere. Like Bichiabu comes in really young from France, right? He's 19 years old. Nusa comes in from Norway, really young. You kind of look at Xavi Simons, he's probably not going to be signing, on a long-term deal if they don't show any signs of ambition. We've talked about Openda and Benjamin Šeško before, and potentially one or maybe both of them being subject to big offers this summer. They have the young Austrians in Nicholas Seewald and Christoph Baumgartner, who, have a little bit more of a link in terms of understanding the RB system, but don't rule out those being players who get big offers in the summer because they're both exceptionally talented. And then they have, the likes of Vermeeren on loan from Atletico Madrid. All of these players are kind of quite crucial to the way that things work. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Leipzig do in this window because they really, really need this season to turn around in order to convince some of these younger players that there is a future pathway here that involves them staying and improving their profile, both in Europe and in the Bundesliga, by playing for a good side. At the moment, they don't feel like a side that are showcasing players in the best way, which is their biggest selling point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, fascinating story of the season. I mean, nobody saw this coming. Obviously, a disaster in the Champions League as well. Just a complete mess, but nobody expected it. And this is what makes it interesting when clubs get the chance to react. Both with players they've already got and players that they might potentially want. What do they do with this squad and how do they alter it slightly to get themselves back on track? Leipzig obviously might not have the kind of global support or eyes on them that some of the other teams have had from this episode, but there's still always a sense of intrigue around Leipzig and you're always kind of looking for what's coming next because they are part of the conveyor belt for those very top teams and often like their next spot is often something like huge. So they're always a team you want to be watching and this season they haven't really been a team you want to watch that much. So very interesting and probably a nice way to wrap up the show, Mo.
Yeah, I've got one more thing for you. It's short, sharp, and quick. Yeah. But I wanted to go to Portugal and talk about Sporting because they brought in a new manager in Rui Borges, who they brought in from Vitória Guimarães. And they've had an interesting start to his campaign. They've had some big wins against Benfica and Porto tonight in the Taça da Liga. They also drew 4-4 with his former club at the weekend. Just a word that Victor Gyökeres has started 2025 with 4 goals in 2 games. So carrying on where he left off. But kind of more than that, Hooiberg is interesting because obviously Sporting tried to go with the continuity plan of employing Joao Pereira and basically sticking with the Amorim system that they've been playing for obviously a number of years. That didn't work. So they have gambled on another young manager who they've brought in after a short tenure at a kind of middle class Primera club. So that's what they did with Amorim. They're going to hope that lightning strikes twice. But, big but. He doesn't play 5 at the back. Plays 4 at the back. And for so long, Sporting haven't needed any fullbacks because they basically played 3 centre-backs and 2 either kind of more defensively minded players, fine, but also flying wingers playing in these wing-back roles. That's what they've utilised so much. I think they're well short in terms of what they need if they're going to play 4 at the back. They have Fresneda, who was, at one point one of the most highly regarded and highly coveted fullbacks in European football. And they have a couple of other players in these spots as well. But there's not loads, right? They've been playing the likes of Giovanni Quenda there. They've been playing Nuno Mendes there. These are players you do not want a left and right back when you're playing with a back 4. Now, Esgaio can do a job there, that's fine. But I do think that Sporting is going to be very interesting to see if they go and actually attack that fullback market for the new manager, because I think he's left a little bit short in terms of what he needs from his right and left backs. So whilst it's been an okay start to life for Hooiberg at Sporting, and I think that it's quite a sensible appointment in many ways, I'm intrigued just to see what they do in that particular niche, because that switch of system is quite a big one in terms of the players you need to fulfill a role.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of restructuring having to go on. And I mean, it's all part of obviously the changes that you make behind the scenes and then how it's reflected on the pitch. And you see it obviously happen in the more high profile leagues, and it gets a lot of column inches written about it and you get podcasts about it. But then ones like that tend to fly under the radar a little bit. So probably not one that we're going to read and hear too much about, but I'm sure your job over the next few months will be to keep us updated into how it actually went.
I'll try my very best to keep you updated. But so far, so good, I think, for Hooiberg Sporting. And look, fingers crossed for him, because that's a tough gig to take on right now. And he's taken it at some pretty short notice. Yes. And with that, I think we're going to probably call this a day. So all that's left for me to do is say thank you very, very much to our transfer guru, Mr. Dean Jones.
Cheers, mate.
I've been Jack Collins. This has been Ranks FC. Thank you so much for listening as ever. The Truth will be back on the main feed this week. Some exciting bits and bobs to explore on Friday, so make sure you're tuned in for that. The return of Sam and Doogie for the first time in 2025. But from us, and for now, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you very shortly, Rank Squad. Take it easy. Peace.